virtual event. I'm Lars Sandvik, chairperson of the Nova District Virginia Production Alliance. Really glad you could join us for this excellent discussion. We have a star-studded cast with us this evening, but first I need to quickly mention the organization that's hosting this special event. The Virginia Production Alliance, or as we call it, the VPA, has provided opportunities for Virginia's film and television community for more than 30 years. The VPA sponsors professional development and networking events, just like this one, and supports people who are building professional film-related careers and businesses. The VPA is also the leading advocate for the Virginia production community, interacting with state lawmakers to help pass legislation that attracts film and television work to our state. So, topic at hand. When I started out in this industry, all high-end projects were shot on film because you had more latitude and an expansive amount of color control over your color depth. Back then, when you said something looked like video, that wasn't really a compliment. But now multiple camera brands have developed entire lines of cameras that are cinematic, used in all kinds of feature films and broadcasts, and we are so spoiled. But with those choices comes great responsibility, specifically not to pick the wrong one for the wrong type of work. You can get great color space, but your client might not need to or might not want to rent a server farm just to do their first rough cut. Others are going straight out live with no post at all. So there's almost too many choices with lots of rental price differences too, which can also be a problem. This evening, we're excited to have several extremely talented directors of photography with us. Peter Nicoll, who's an experienced director of photography, who's worked on all kinds of commercials and documentaries, and has recently, I believe, been made one of the creative presenters for Hurlbut Academy. Jim Ball, who's also a fantastic DP who has worked on numerous commercials, documentaries, and some of the highest rated reality series. Dennis Bonney, almost 40 years as a DP and Steadicam op. He shot in 58 different nations. Almost 20 years as a principal DP on the PBS series Journey to the Planet Earth, hosted by Matt Damon. He always preferred the look of film, which led him to embrace the look of Arri, which was one of the first digital capture cameras that closely emulated the aesthetic of film. So Peter Nicoll and Jim Ball are live at DC Camera tonight with just 4 of the most popular brands of camera lines to talk about. But first, Peter's going to give us a 10,000-foot overview of a few major camera things to consider. So Peter, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks for having us. Glad to be here. So I also want to introduce Arish Roland, who has been the owner of DC Camera from the beginning and has shot many Academy Award-winning documentaries and commercials that aren't eligible for Academy Award, but they're still pretty darn good. We're going to try to cover a lot of things, and it's not going to be 100% accurate. We're not going to get into specs and details that much. We're going to talk about overview, comparing camera systems, and ultimately making a choice around a variety of factors that you're trying to put together. So it's not going to be cut and dried. We're going to try to keep it fairly objective and just talk about the strengths and weaknesses of all of these systems, and how they work as a system now as these things have evolved. Everything's gotten much more refined than it was when the 5D Mark II started shooting 29.97 in 2009. So we've got a lot more options, and there's not just a Genesis and a 5D kicking around. We've got a couple of other options. So I'm going to put a little slide up. And there are considerations that you should look into whenever you look at any camera at all. Connectivity, meaning your SDI, HDMI ports. Does it have time code? What are your audio inputs? Those sorts of things are extremely important depending on the size of your production. Do you have a sound person? Do you have multiple cameras? All of these things play into making a decision about how you assess things. Codec and bit rates are very important in discussing with producers, post-production, and the DP to make sure that everyone is going to be delivering what they need to on time and in the right color space. Sensitivity, some of these cameras are going to be a lot faster or dual ISO native. So you're going to be having an 800 ISO and then a higher option, which gives you some better low light capabilities. But most of these are fast enough at this point that with even moderate light and fast lenses, you're going to get a lot of really good images. Frame rate, There's a lot of documentary stuff that does not call for anything other than 2398 or 2997. But if you do need frame rates, it's a very important thing to have the high speed choices. They're all roughly in the same category now in terms of that. Lens mount options are an interesting thing. For example, Sony has the E mount, which is a very thin flange, which allows you to put a variety of lenses on the camera. And some are maybe more limiting, but then of course, like the EF mount gives you the widest range of lenses available. Ergonomics, can you pick the camera up, put it on your shoulder and use it, or put it on a gimbal, or put it on a sticks or any kind of Fisher dolly or anything like that. Battery life, what's that?
Or a jib.
Or a jib, exactly. Thanks. Yes. Thank you for covering that. Battery life is a big one. If you're out shooting all day and you don't have power where you are, being able to carry a backpack full of small batteries is really great. Look or aesthetic, which I brought down in the list here just because they're all really create really great images, and you can create incredible images with any of them with the right tools, time, rigging, any number of things. Usability is just how much you can turn things on, how much you can turn things off, and just get the camera out and shooting as fast as possible. Availability is an interesting question because oftentimes you'll start a production, or there'll be a documentary production that'll be happening all over the United States simultaneously, and you'll need to create different teams and different things. Accessing cameras, picking a camera system is really important because if you can't get it in certain places, or if it's hard to find, or if it's very specific, you'll have trouble matching those later on. Cost is always a factor, sort of what's your budget. And then build and use options, because some cameras lend themselves to gimbals really nicely, but don't lend themselves to handheld very well. And you've got a variety of other permutations. And again, this is a very brief overview. These are the Netflix capture requirements. And we're just going to talk about this very briefly, only because it's fairly relevant in terms of what is considered a standard. Netflix actually just bought MGM today. So I'm sorry, Amazon. You're right. They have standards too, but again, and so there's the fact that Netflix cares about their codecs and their sizes and everything else is very important. Cameras must have a true 4K UHD sensor, which is a 3840 photosites wide. That's the bare minimum for what is considered 4K. That's Ultra HD. DCI 4K is the other standard, which is a 17 by 9. 3840 is 16 by 9. Capture formats can be raw, compressed, minimum of a 16-bit linear or 10-bit log processing. We could spend 3 days discussing the difference between those two and what goes on under the hood, and we're not, sorry. And a minimum data rate of 240 megabits per second, and 10-bit UHD 2398. Capture transfer function, which is basically the color space that you're capturing. And then of course the varieties that come out from Sony, Red, Canon, and Alexa. And obviously they don't want anything baked in. So, and the other actually key thing about this, which I think is an interesting thing, is all files must contain all metadata. And why is that important? Because when you go into a large production and you have cameras that all have AO1 or C1 or whatever it is the clip name, and you shoot 10 clips of something on this camera, and then you put it into post, every single reel looks exactly the same, and every single clip is exactly the same. And let's say you move that to online or to a colorist, and they have to reconnect all of those, and it's in a timeline, and suddenly the names are not different enough to identify what's going on, and you go into another 2 days of reconnecting all this stuff. So market share, most features are shot on film, ARRI, Red, and Sony Venice, as roughly as 2020. You look at Sundance or who won the Oscars or any of those other things. Most doc features are shot on Canon and Sony, but Red and ARRI appear in that depending on the size of the production. Modern corporate and industrial work can use a variety of cameras, and the lines have blurred there quite a lot in terms of what you're using, because there's so much content being generated now. People are using ARRIs on corporate shoots. reality TV documentary stuff can be anything, but it needs to usually account for longer record times and battery life. And that kind of goes back to the usability portion of how you pick a camera, is that being able to record for long periods of time and have that camera stay up and running without having to swap Anton Bauer bricks and powering down is incredibly important at that point. And any camera can be used for any project if the appropriate considerations are made. So you can make any of this stuff work if you are prepared, you have enough support, and you have the infrastructure to support it, or it's rigged. You know, it's put on some sort of system that allows you to either use a viewfinder or a monitor. You know, like the FX3 has this little, you know, XLR input, which, you know, allows you to have some, you know, compact audio issues or inputs as needed. I'm just going to go into say, like, we were focusing on Sony, Canon, Red, and ARRI, but I'm just going to give an honorable mention to the Panasonic VariCam 35, which has arguably one of the best looking sensors available, but it never really caught on, much to Erish's unhappiness and chagrin, having bought 2 of them early on. But that's the general thing, and I can stop there, Lars, and let us go into other things, or I can continue to plow on for the next 40 minutes. So I don't know where you want to go.
I think that is a great overview. I want to add to all the folks listening, please do submit questions in the chat. Once we've gone through some of these families of cameras, some of the pros and cons and other practical applications, we'll definitely tackle some of the questions. But from that standpoint, I think, Peter, I would just take away the first group. Are we going with Sony first?
We are going with Sony first. Let me just get there. So the Sony Cine line is, and I'm just focusing on a lot of the more modern stuff that's existing right now. So that's the FX3, the F5. They still include the F65, but that's really not something that we're all going to come in contact with very often. Our FS7 Mark II, which is sort of, you can lift a rock anywhere in the world and find an FS7 or an FS7 Mark II somewhere, much like a C300 Mark II, pretty much anywhere. The FS6, the FX9, the F55 is still in this because it's a global shutter camera and they both shoot 4K, and it's actually a quite robust system still. What Sony does really well is they create systems, and the lower tier cameras, they kind of don't eat their young. Whereas if you invest in some of these, like the FS7 or the FX9, there's a huge firmware thing that's going on that allows you to kind of continue to grow the camera as you own it, which is really nice. And then of course we have the Venice, which is a full frame system. The Sony Cine stuff is very flexible because of the E-mount. You can put any lenses on it you want. It covers a wide range of camera sizes and abilities. Jim is very fond of it because of its autofocus stuff that goes into it.
As my eyes get older.
As your eyes get older and you need to do all those sorts of things. The new FX line is full frame, which is great. So everything from this little guy all the way up to the Venice, which is behind us here, that hammer right there, is all very nice. And the image color-wise in the Sonys, they did come from a long time of broadcast background, and they tend to push a little blue-green. The bigger cameras have excellent ergonomics. You can pick up an FX9 and just do whatever you want with it. You put it on your shoulder, use the EVF that comes with it, and it's pretty passable as a tool. None of the Sonys, even the Venice, provide internal RAW recording, which is an unusual thing, but they all provide raw output. They tend to have a fairly good battery life, except up to the FX9. I can't speak to the Venice. I'm assuming it's more along the lines of the Alexa and Red in terms of power consumption. And they provide a decent amount of frame rates. So you can get 4K at 60 frames per second with the FX9, and the FX3 will actually support 120 frames at UHD. It will not do a DCI 4K, which is sort of your typical cinema frame rate, or I'm sorry, frame aspect ratio size. So it's a little bit limited there. And Jim, you've been using the new stuff a lot lately. So
yeah,
talk about it.
Yeah, it's a great family. Like when he talks about Canon, the same way. It's just they all match very well, and you've got an ergonomic progression of very small all the way up to bigger sizes, and they each have a specialized task. I mean, I work a lot these days with 2 and 3 cameras on a shoot. I mean, it's almost like still photographers. You hand one body back, pick up another for a certain job, and they're inexpensive enough where you can configure them all for a specific task and not waste time changing lenses, putting out a gimbal, putting hand grips on, putting it in studio mode. You just go to the other camera, and it's great. And so I've enjoyed that for smaller budget, smaller crude productions that still want, good production value.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of cameras that go out, Arish, from here, in terms of the Sony line, what are we sort of seeing at this point?
Yeah, FS7 still very popular. FX9 has kind of come into its own, and now the FX6, which is starting to ship in better numbers, can't keep it on the shelf. So
Yeah,
really
that's
between
our,
those three, and the A7s.
This is our FX9 or FS6 right here. This is an A7S3. And then this cut shot here is the FX9. So we're looking at Sony's all right now as we do all of this.
I
Like,
will
like the
say,
depth of field there.
Yeah, yep,
I will say, I feel like there was a jump from the FS series to
Absolutely.
the FX series in quality of the image. The S-Cinetone, for baking in a look is
Yeah.
a lot better than Rec 709, and the noise changed a lot too from, the base ISO in the FS series is like 2000.
right.
And now you have an 800 base ISO, and
Right.
it's just a cleaner image. So
Just-
there was a demarcation point there that I think was significant.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's an interesting thing to note is that we are sort of in a wonderful period of time within camera systems that all of them will do a very good job. And with the advent of certain color correction tools like Rep 2020, some of these other pieces, which again, too broad to get into right now, all these cameras can match and play together nicely if you're careful, and it's exposing them the way each camera system likes to be exposed. Now, I will just talk about the FX line is all full frame right now, and that's an interesting thing to consider because it's what would be considered the 5D. It would be considered full frame 35, which, brief background, you had 35 millimeter, and then they started putting audio on it, and then they went to a Super 35, 2 perf and 3 perf, then Academy, and then 4 perf, which is this guy right here. You can sort of see this is not the best resolution, but you've got your Super 35 APS-C. You've got a variety of things, and of course you've got VistaVision. And 65 millimeter film on there. VistaVision and full frame 35 millimeter are roughly the same size. And just to confuse you and make your head hurt more, this is from 2018. This is a digital film and sensor chart to show you all of the different frame sizes. So not all images and sensors are all the same. When you get a full frame, you are getting a narrower depth of field traditionally. It's a slightly wider field of view, and it does change things up quite a bit in terms of everything we're doing. We think we're looking, this camera is it in full frame or is it Super 35 Pro?
I believe it's Super 35.
Okay, so we're in Super 35 right now, which is what we all looked at for our entire lives for the most part in terms of film. And now we're starting to see a lot more things going on where we have full frame stuff being shot for Netflix. There's a ton of stuff that's being shot in full frame for all sorts of productions, and that provides a very interesting space to kind of create color. I'm going to go back now to the Canon Cinema EOS line, and I apologize that I'm moving so fast and talking so fast. I just want to fit as much of this in as possible.
It's actually a great thing.
Because it's a huge thing. So we've got things like the EOS C70 right here, which hopefully is switching. I don't know if we're on a delay here or not. There we go. Just monitoring ourselves a little strangely. This little guy is sort of in the same ballpark between the FX3 and the FX6 up here. It's Super 35 only. That's the C200. And then this is a C500 Mark II. There is also the C300 Mark II and Mark III, which exist now that are quite nice. And you can sort of see there is a C700, which is their full frame system. it's a little bit, interesting there in terms of that. But the C500 does full frame, and it does a whole bunch of other stuff. Lars, are we
Well, it's
dithering here? Are
yeah,
we
it's a
losing
little
anything?
like Devo or a music video
Yeah.
or something. I don't know if it's worth starting and stopping your connection or something.
Yeah, maybe let's do this. Let me why don't you go and have a little chat with Dennis, and we'll reboot the switcher here and see if we come back to life.
That sounds great. And it wouldn't be a Zoom event without some kind of technical hiccup, even amongst some of the most technically savvy people that I know.
Well, the computers have a mind of their own. So,
Yes, they do.
yeah.
They do. Not to jump.
If I can just step in for one sec there, Lars. I just had a real world experience with some of the new technology as an old timer who came up shooting almost exclusively film and then every iteration of video since. I was on a shoot over at the White House with the First Lady, and I was doing the Steadicam, but a very talented DP shooting the stuff on a dolly was using an FX9, and he literally put a 35 millimeter prime up, put enough ND to be shooting at a nice fat aperture like a 2.8, and did a slow dolly into the First Lady, letting the camera do the focus pull. And that was a first for me in almost 40 years, trusting the technology at that level on that important a shoot. And so the technology finally has really matured, it seems, and you can trust it. I have my trusty AC there with his wireless follow focus to pull my focus, but the other gentleman just let his camera do it, and I've seen the shot and it looks fantastic.
That is really impressive. And as a Steadicam operator, you need to have a serious ninja on your follow focus.
Yeah.
Same thing with the jib a little bit, because suddenly you're going into focus and then you're coming out of focus again.
Yeah.
And if they have tracking technology like that tracks faces, which is like the new exciting thing, that's really cool.
Pretty impressive. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent tools to use.
Yeah.
Well, I know that, and one reason I brought you in was, well, actually, how are things looking at DC camera too? Peter, are you guys doing okay? Looks like you're back in motion, but I think you might be muted.
Still muted, I think.
I see you waving. Everything but sound. Looks great though. Okay, it says you're unmuted on the interface, but it's not producing sound just yet. So we'll let them work on that for a minute.
Sure.
So Dennis, I love Amira's a lot, Aries and Alexa's. They have such a beautiful image, and I know that so much of your work has been has a foundation of the Arri family.
Yeah, well, the big thing to know about the Aries and all, everything has evolved over the years. But when they came out with their first digital camera, part of what really made it unique was they didn't have the most pixels by any means, but they really concentrated on making them the best pixels. Mm-hmm. So Red became an early competitor. Getting into shaking up the whole industry basically as it moved into the digital realm, from primarily 35 millimeter and super 16 millimeter production. But so Arri didn't go for the most pixels, but they went for the truest. So they were trying to pretty much have the most faithful color reproduction and the greatest dynamic range, and have you have that wide dynamic range between your highlights and your shadow area, but the way that you roll off in the overexposed area and go from still having some information to losing it, they did it very elegantly, almost as elegantly as film does. So for those reasons, I was attracted to their platform as opposed to the competitors like Sony or Panasonic. I've owned Panasonic cameras. I had an F900 in the Sony line, one of their the first 1080 camera they produced. And I had Varicams and whatever the 3700s. I had the Sony beta cams and digibetas and used all the different companies' technology, but I always felt like Arri had a very robust camera. They were always heavy. That was oppressive in terms of form factor. They're heavy. They're expensive. They're heavy. They require a lot of power, but they produce a beautiful image. And now they've made them smaller and lighter. When you get a mini these days, it's a 6-pound body that you're pretty much controlling with your cell phone. So like all these cameras, they now have reduced the size and weight, and you can configure them in an almost endless array of options.
Well, I'm always a big admirer of all my friends that shoot Arri. Your work is fantastic. And also Mark Walpole, I'll float his name out there. He's a big Arri guy.
Yeah.
Now, from my experience, people will pull me out onto set to fly a jib. And I have something that I call the Arri accessory kit. And that consists of 4 50-pound plate weights to add to the back to make sure that we can fly it around. But man, what a picture. It is just so beautiful.
Well, but with all this technology, it changes so dramatically that the $87,000 Arri Alexa that I bought in 2011, you can pick up on eBay for about $3,500 these days.
Oh, man.
So, yeah.
Well, it still requires an operator that knows how to make it work. So it can be a beautiful thing when it's used right.
Yeah.
Well, let me see how our guys are doing. I think they're not quite back on yet. So, Lindsay, do you want to open up a couple of questions? Maybe Dennis and I can take a listen to.
Absolutely. So one of the first questions was from Marshall, and he asked, what is your view on the pairing of the Canon EOS R5 and the upcoming Atmos Ninja V Plus?
That, interestingly, is kind of more of a Peter Nicoll question.
Yeah. I was gonna say, give that one
I will
to Peter.
absolutely save that. Sure. Another question. Yeah.
Please.
Another question from Daniela. Why do you think it's so rare to see Sony cinema line cams in the narrative field?
That's interesting because I feel like the FS7, at least for the last 5 years, has probably been, and Peter was right when he said you can't lift up a rock anywhere in the country and not find an FS7. Right. It is, especially if you dial it in right, it is really nice. If you know your way around the S-Log color space, you can shoot in such a way that it'll still give you the latitude that you need, and you can make adjustments to take in almost every little bit of a sunset, even if you have noise compared to something like Red or Arri. But I think for narrative work, I would almost say that price-wise, an FS7 would probably be my go-to. But that, of course, is depends on budget and depends on the type of narrative work too. What do you think, Dennis?
I think it's a little bit cyclical, and there was a time when Sony had not really matured with their technology early on, and guys like me that were forced to shoot with their cameras when clients dictated, or that's what was available. We were very careful about not overexposing because you had very little room up top. They addressed that problem big time, and the FS7 and all the Sony cameras now have a great reputation for handling that dynamic range, and they overexpose very well. But it takes time for perception in the markets. When you get to the higher end, it seems to be dominated by Red and Arri at this point. And then the Venice comes out, and it's a great camera, but it's going to be a little bit of time until the market catches up and people have a chance to get them out on set and put them through their paces and, more shows are shot with them, and people say, "Hey, that looks great. What'd they shoot that on?" You know.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, Arri was among the first to break through in the cinema space. Red, of course, had a revolutionary camera that burst onto the scene, but not without some problems.
Yep, that's exactly right. Can you guys hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you. How you
All right.
doing?
Hey,
Back live from, are we in Vienna or Fairfax here? technically?
Fairfax.
We're in Fairfax. Excellent.
Fairfax, Merrifield.
Merrifield, all that general vicinity.
You bet.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that because of Netflix requirements, the Sony Venice has actually gotten a lot more play and early adoption than it probably would have normally, just because of the fact that there was a sudden demarcation in the ARRI, and we'll talk about that briefly soon, where suddenly their resolutions were not adequate, even though feature films and IMAX programs were being shot in this format and projected at very, very large aspect ratios and apertures and very, very big screens. So it's a very bizarre and difficult thing, but you talk about Netflix and specs and bit rate and all those other things, and it becomes a very strange conversation when you start to unpack it all. So, all right, we're gonna go back. Sorry, I apologize for the technical glitch. We've rebooted everything. I will say one thing about production is that like combat or war is that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And so you always have to be prepared. And that's another reason why all of these camera systems, you have to be familiar with them. You have to rely on them in certain ways and know what their limitations are so that you can use them to the best of your ability. Quickly, just talking about the Canon Cinema EOS line. The EF mount is the most common lens. There's so many lenses out there by so many different manufacturers. You're getting cinema lenses and EF mount. It's amazing. So if you are to go in that direction, it does give you a lot of flexibility. It looks like with the C70, they're moving to a RF mount, which is their new mirrorless mount, which is very much like the Sony E. And the way that works here, and perhaps we'll just do this real quick. And I'm going to hand this to you, Jim.
mine.
Yep. So there is a flange distance in here. See if that picks it up for the EF mount, and that's the same for PL because there was room for the mirror, or there was room for the for just the film plane in cameras, especially with the PL mount like this guy here that protrudes into the actual. There's the mount, and it protrudes into everything that's there. Whereas, let's put that lens back on. Whereas something like, yeah, that's E-mount.
Mhm.
This is
Very
the
shallow.
very shallow. Yeah, the E-mount there, it's a great example. So the
And
E-mount is,
somewhat
sorry?
delicate.
it is very delicate. You have to make sure that, especially if you're going to put something like these big lenses on, that you have to support it. But the EF mount is the same way. I mean, the flange on those things is not great. And I don't know if you can do a tight shot over with the FX9 on these two mounts here. Just show the difference. And obviously, this lens is brand new. This is a Fujinon Premista 28-100 full frame lens. So it's literally a beast. It's a brick shithouse of a lens. Covers full frame VistaVision, whereas this is limited to Super 35 only. So even though you can put it on a Sony E-mount camera that has full frame, it does not allow you to shoot in full frame, or it gets windowed or vignetted.
Right, the cameras will crop to allow you to use the
Correct.
cameras, but depends on the camera. Not
Depends on
all
the
of them
camera,
do.
and not all of them do them equally. So check your mileage on all of these things. So Canon Cinema EOS stuff tends to push warmer skin tones. As you can sort of see here, like they kind of come out of the box not in the greatest ergonomic setup properly. They have to kind of be rigged if you want to be on a handheld, although this does strip down nicely now to go on gimbals and other things, and it's a very flexible system. They provide a variety of inputs and ports on every single one of their cameras. We can look here, and even just comparing the C70 with the this is the C500 Mark II. 300? Oh, it's a 300. The 500 and the 300 have the exact same body now, which is really nice. But you have your audio inputs, your mic, you have USB, HDMI out, and I believe this has the ability to receive timecode somewhere, although I'm not quite sure where is it on the camera because I've never had to use it. And maybe that's through the USB port. But anyway, and you have breakout boxes, much like the Sonys do and everything else that allow you to have some connectivity within all these. And we go to battery life, and these cameras tend to run longer like the Sonys. The big difference with all of these is starting at the C200, which is this guy over here, which has some decent sized compact flash express card ports. It allows you to do Cinema Raw Lite, which Canon Cinema Raw was the largest codec in the history of codecs. It was huge and completely unusable for most situations. The Odyssey had to like shoehorn it down into something that you could record to and make it ProRes. It was a mess. But so that's it. Pretty interesting that starting at the C200, so only the C70 doesn't shoot RAW internally. The C70 or C200 and higher all have an internal RAW now, based with the C300 Mark II, the C300 Mark III, C500 Mark II, and then going up obviously to the C700 and all those things, which most of us won't ever see. And then there's a wide variety of color spaces and gamma spaces to shoot in. It seems to have a couple of more options than Sony, but in terms of true usability, they're roughly the same. And they all have decent frame rate selections. That's one big thing now, is they're all kind of on the same playing field. The Canon stuff does seem to provide DCI 4K high frame rate recording a little bit more throughout the line, whereas the FX3 is limited to UHD only in terms of slow motion, which is really, I call it overcrank just because that's what you made the film run through the camera body faster, and then you would play it back at 23.98 or 24 frames per second, technically, because that's what they were then, and you would get slow motion. So great cameras, really beautiful, and honestly, over the years, throughout the docs that I've shot, we started on, like for RBG, for example, we started on the Amira early on, and then moved to the C300 Mark II. And I would challenge anyone, to know which ones were shot on the Amira and which ones were shot on the C300 Mark II. They're treated nicely. They look very similar, and that's true for pretty much all of the system. So what time is it now? It's 7:09. We got to keep punching. All right. So now red. So red is sort of got a nebulous history overall. It's they've got the red one and all these other things, and then the DSMC1 bodies, which are here. This is the red Gemini, and what's really interesting about these systems is that there really isn't much to the body. The brain can be tiny. You can take off all of this, strip it down, and it's this tiny little sensor that does record RAW and ProRes. So, which is a pretty interesting combination of things to have as an option within this. It will also simultaneously record RAW and ProRes and make matching proxies within it. So you literally get a folder with 1080 ProRes LT or ProRes HQ proxies in the same folder with your 5K, 6K, 8K RAW files, which is an incredibly powerful offline tool for a variety of things. And it's quite exciting. So there's multi-mount options. The mount can be removed here, and you can put any mount. It does have a deeper flange, the way the PL mount. This is a PL mount here, in case anyone's not ever seen one. And thank you.
Those are just really tough mounts you can almost hammer nails with.
You can, and once you put it in the camera, it's not moving, and it's a wonderful thing in that respect. And also, you just don't have to worry about that lens, the weight of a lens ripping the front of the mount off the camera, which you can in the E-mount and EF systems. And
with those, you got to use the rails, and you got to,
yeah, and supports, absolutely. So Not great ergonomics. Holding a camera all day is extremely important. And as we all can attest, we have the Lifetime Achievement Award of both shoulder pain and spine pain from holding a camera. They are flexible for any configuration. You can kind of build it into whatever you need it to. Not the best audio inputs out there. So I see this more as I've used it in dock situations. I own a Red. And I've used it in that situation, but it's not my first choice for that. Depending on the situation, if I have a sound person, I will absolutely, offer a Red if that's what the production wants. But if you're doing self-supported audio in a dock situation, is not your friend.
Didn't they come up with the Ranger to make it more?
Yes, well,
all
there's
in one?
more cinema and much more like the Alexa Studio configurations. This thing is taking a wavelet compression of 6K, 5K, 8K, and compressing it into this codec that is one of the most powerful editorial and coloring codecs you can possibly get on the market. It's still, from the day it came out till now, it's been great. What I have is a Komodo. The Komodo is actually had some minor differences in the sense that will do 4K and Red RAW, but they've simplified it to just 3 settings now, which makes it really nice. But these are great. They're a lot more reliable than they used to. They can shoot a variety of frame rates, which is really interesting. And also, what's great about this camera in use is it will literally in camera support with spherical lenses. So we're not going to get too far into what anamorphic and spherical lenses are, but most of these systems can support anamorphic, which is squeezing and de-squeezing the image as you bring it into the sensor. So you can use more of the vertical height of the sensor. But using spherical lenses, which are not the J.J. Abrams lens with all the lens flares and all that good stuff. Just an average lens. I mean, everything here is they're still all spherical. This can,
Did you? Around here somewhere. Oh, yeah, that one.
this guy.
That guy there.
Oh, yeah, the PS Technic. All right, so this one is a 2 times anamorphic. And again, that's a whole other bag of cats choices, lens choices. We could, again, we could all get old having that conversation, much like we're getting old having this conversation. But so what this does is this will do 2, 3, 5 to 1. It'll do 17:9, 16:9, and 4:3. All really easily. You can just select it. You can go into a widescreen mode, and that gives you more frame rate options in terms of overcrank and all sorts of things. So if you're literally there and you're talking to somebody and you're like, having a creative discussion about how you want to frame it and what the aspect ratio is, you can literally say, well, this is what widescreen looks like, and this is what 16:9 looks like, and this is what 4K or 5K or 6K in the traditional DCI sense is Digital Cinema Institute standard. Is that what DCI stands for? I don't know, one of those things. So anyways, that's the Red. It's got a very specific look to it that is pleasing to a lot of people. You're seeing more and more of the productions that are out there shot on the Red Monstro for Netflix and Amazon stuff. But it still kind of has its own personality and its own look. But the great thing about it is the color correction ability on it is so great. And it's a small, easily moved camera that you can use it for a variety of productions. You can put 9 of them in an array for plate shooting and everything else, or just throw it on a gimbal. Like mine, the parts literally just come off, and you just take this and I have a receiver at the top that has a handle here, and I slide it off, and I have another receiver down here on a dovetail, and I can just go straight on the Movi with it and right in, and I can be up and running in 20 minutes or less, sometimes 10, depending on if everything's behaving nicely. So that size is a pain in the butt, but it's also really helpful for a lot of other things in terms of turning over. If you don't have 3 or 4 cameras that you can have set up, or smaller systems that you can put on to different things, and you're traveling with just one camera, you can do a lot with it. All right.
Say that of all the projects that kind of come through our sphere of influence, when they are commercials, the most popular one for commercials seems to be Red. I mean, when you have like real separate departments and people are all
Right.
Working
Yep.
on it.
Absolutely. It's an unusual thing, but it's it can work as a single operator camera. I've certainly done it plenty of times, but it's definitely requires a little bit of wrangling and knowing how the beast behaves. And I've only had one brick on me once, but it bricked. So it's what all cameras have. I had my Sony DSR 390 in 2002. The optical block went bad on it, and that was it, you know. But all those things happen. All right.
I had to turn my area on and off once.
What's that?
I had to turn my Alexa on and off once.
Right. Exactly.
In 2011, once.
Well, so ARRI Alexa, Amira, Alexa LF, Alexa 65 are they are the gold standard in film production, and their color is going to be film-like. It's got a golden green tone to it. It sort of mimics the film. What's really interesting about how the Alexa was developed is that they started, and this was long before the actual camera shipped, is they started in post-production first. And they looked at color sampling, and they looked at a lot of other things that went into how to capture film, how to look at what the roll-off is, and they experimented with the capture format and the digital processing for that first, which, I mean, just back up for a second. Digital signal processing, sometimes called DSP. Most of these sensors sort of share the same systems now, but the hardware that's plugged into them is what matters. So you have an A7S III versus like the FX9 versus the FX6 or the 9 or the Venice. The Venice is actually an A9 sensor. But if you look at that thing, there's a whole bunch of heat sinks and all sorts of other stuff and hardware going into it that is pulling that information and processing it in a very different way. It's computing power. So what ARRI did and nailed a long time ago was how to capture and get all of this together in a way that works seamlessly. They have their own internal quality assurance people that are only report to the CEO of ARRI. And so if they go and see that the camera is not performing or there is a problem with the software, they don't have a conversation with the engineers. They go to the CEO and they will delay release of a product because of that. Now, that means you're going to pay a little bit more, or a lot more in the case of all of these, than you would for a lot of other cameras. You know, Sony will ship with beta firmwares. Reds will be run beta firmware. You know, I mean, there's a lot of other things out there, whereas the ARRI has nailed the look, has nailed the production pipeline, and has a sensor that has worked forever. It's 11 years old, and we're still watching stuff shot on the Alexa.
Beautiful.
It's really, what's that?
Beautiful stuff.
Beautiful stuff. You know, it's all, you know, everybody's has like Alexa is the standard. It's crazy, from Marvel movies to other small rom-coms or whatever. I mean, the Alexa Mini and the Amira are all there. I mean, the big difference between all the camera bodies within the ARRI thing, would you hand me the Mini, Jim? So this is the Mini, and this is kind of, I guess, what you would see as like the camera that, I'm just gonna let that guy down.
It's about 6 pounds, isn't it?
Well, rigged, I mean, that's the thing is like the reality of this is that just because it's light doesn't mean it can be light. Once you put all the stuff on it, you need to run it. There's a lot of power requirements. There's a lot of input requirements. And in fact, something like this has the exact same sensor that's in the Amira back here, which is a more standard production camera that you can use. It's got a built-in, it has an EVF, it has everything right there. It's got audio, real XLR inputs as opposed to a dongle here or some of these other things. You can get to the cards, like for example, on this guy, the card bay is buried back here. And if you have this thing rigged a certain way, like, well, you're just not going to be able to change it easily. It's a single card, whereas that guy is dual slot, and it's made to go on your shoulder. So it's a little different in the way that it's designed, and it literally comes out of the box. You put a lens on it, you put a battery on it, you put media in it, and you start rolling. And there's no fiddling with stuff that goes into that. So what's fascinating about how ARRI's approached it is that the sensor is the same. The capabilities differ a little bit among each of the cameras, but the Amira and the Alexa Studio, the original one, and the Mini are all the same sensor. Now we have the LF, that's two of the exact same sensors stuck together vertically.
Right.
And then the Alexa 65 is 3. So they have literally leaned into this color space and this color science and this capture format so much that it's absolutely crazy. The RE system up until recently still would not shoot what's considered a true 4K. It was up-resing from a 3.2K to 3.8. It was never doing a true DCI 4K in that sense. It was doing an approximation up-resed, upscaled of 3840 by 2160 or UHD. And that became a problem for Netflix and Amazon and all the people who were like, well, it has to always be 4K, regardless of the fact that like they're projecting all over the world with 2K images. And that was Ari's decision early on, is that they said, look, 2K is kind of what you did. You didn't do a 4K scan on film, you did a 2K scan, and that's what we would use for optical stuff. So it's a very interesting conversation with that. And I'll just go back through some of these things right here. So it's records ProRes and RE RAW. Those are the two primary things. It's nothing else. And I don't think the Mini records RE RAW, and the Amira does not record RE RAW. You have to have the separate external back for that to some
No,
degree.
the Amira will do ARRI RAW.
What's
I
that?
think. Will it not do ARRI RAW, the Amira?
I don't think it does.
You need a separate recorder?
Or maybe
I think
it's
it might
probably,
have come with a firmware, but
maybe there's a firmware. So what they do is they actually license certain technology within these things. And that's sort of why it's like sometimes you don't know if it can do it, whether or not you have the
Yeah.
firmware in the camera at the time. And now you can like rent the firmware, which is bizarre. So you can rent it for a production. It's easy to use. The original Alexa was designed to operate on a film set, very much like we don't have a studio here, do we? No, they don't. They're big beasts. And they are designed to operate like a film camera. I mean, what's the analog? I mean, it's it's like 435, or what's the
analog
Analog.
film camera.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an
But
analog film camera.
this is roughly the size of
Yeah, and
an
it's
Alexa Studio.
Right, exactly. And of
With
course,
with the back.
with the back on it. Yeah. Whereas this one this back on here allows you to record RAW for the Sony Venice. And it does actually get a little smaller if you wanted to use any of their internal recording codecs. So only the RALF and RE65 are Netflix approved. They say that 90% of the film has to be captured in Netflix approved things, but that includes like an A7S and a bunch of other things. So it's a little strange. There are a variety of lens mounts. You can put EF mount, PL mount, and what RA has developed now called LPL, which is now another confusion, which it exists. We won't talk about it other than that. And it's got great high-speed frame rates. Like the Mini is kind of like a go-to production film camera in a lot of situations. It'll do 200 frames a second, high-speed over crank in ProRes. It will do support 444 within the recording. And so it does a lot of other stuff that everybody else doesn't. And that's what is so popular, is that the ProRes, you slot it into any machine anywhere in the world and it plays back. And you can, you can cut it anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And the smaller the codecs, the H.264 stuff, the HEVC stuff coming out of an Apple phone, the H.265, all will absolutely murder a computer. It's impossible for it to get. It's not the bit rate. It's not the size, the speed of the hard drives anymore. It's how much work you're making the processors and the graphics processing handle. And so it's a bear. H.264 is a bear to edit because you just can't scrub it. It just won't play. So, and then, just again, the images for all of these things have been projected everywhere in the world. It's still the standard, and it's an interesting conversation about what's important in an image, in the sense that it's not resolution. It's not necessarily even how many stops you get. We can talk about color space. All of these cameras capture around 15 to 14 stops. Sometimes they claim 16. Your mileage may vary. But what's amazing is that Rec 709, which is what all of our televisions exist as, except for the HDR ones that exist now, only show about 7 stops. So we're capturing 15 stops and we're showing 7 stops. And so our brains are used to seeing only 7 stops of light in a digital image. I went to the ASC and I took the master class about 5 years ago, and we shot on an original Alexa SXT at the Mole Richardson stage. And then we went to eFilm and colored it. And they had their big 30-foot projector and all the stuff. And we were looking at it in Rec 709. And we did all the color within that space. And then they wheeled out this Sony Dolby 65-inch Dolby certified HDR screen. And they pushed the button to make it HDR in Resolve, which is that's the short version of that. And we looked at it and it blew my mind. It was the same sensor, same footage, same lighting, same color, and it looked totally different. So contrast and color are often what our eyes see in terms of the value of how we assess an image. And so what we need to see is that gradation from light to dark. We need to have this relationship with light that shows us depth, that shows us dimension in a way that you just don't get when you start squishing stuff down. And so that's just something to think about with all these things, is that the resolution doesn't matter as much as the color space and how much of that light you're capturing and how much of that you're exposing within all these things. And that's why right now, anything on this table would be pretty happy to work with, depending on the situation. It's a great time to be alive and operating cameras.
I would love very much to bring Dennis Bonney in on the ARRI.
Yes, absolutely.
It'd be super remiss if we didn't.
Well, no, just echoing a little bit of what Peter's talking about with regard to the whole ARRI platform. It does seem to have this very faithfully reproduced color, which when you think about it, so much of what we all end up doing as filmmakers is shoot people talking. And, while of course there's a lot more exciting stuff to shoot, a lot of narrative filmmaking is the dialogue. That's how you further your story. Documentary filmmaking, it's getting experts talking about whatever subject matter. So, the reality of life is we shoot a lot of talking heads. And in a simple talking head, you can say, do we really need so much technology and a really expensive camera and great lenses and all of that? I'm old school, and I think a well-lit, well-framed, compelling talking head can further the story quite a bit and should not be taken lightly. So I appreciate the subtle nuance in terms of how the Alexa looks. And I've been very blessed because I've had every other camera available to me and in my rental inventory, because clients ask for a certain camera and I just do the math. And whether I like the FS7 as much, being honest, I don't, but it's certainly a perfectly good camera. And if you execute well, your clients are going to be thrilled with the image. So, do I prefer the ARRI? Absolutely. Do they each have their place? Absolutely. And you can even mix and match. Very often a client will want a second angle on something. So even though I get hung up on all of the subtle nuance and appreciate the image in a way that my end client may not be as tuned in, you can't even put a competing technology as a cutaway camera. And if you do things well, have enough latitude in your color correct and in post to make it so that most viewers wouldn't even be able to detect the difference.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In terms of matching lenses, and lens matching is more important than sensor, and especially with some of the color correction tools now with Rec 2020, which kind of strips a lot of the camera color metadata away. You're now looking at how the elements of the lens and the color of the lens, the flare characteristics, how well or how not well corrected a lens is, right, becomes the more defining factor into the character of the image compared to the actual color science of the sensor behind it. And so if it's glass and lighting most of the time, as well as a good composition, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And Jim, how about from your galaxy as well, your experiences with ARRI?
Well, the two tiers that we've been kind of hinting at, Canon and Sony, on lower budget things, and then Airy and Red, the gold standard. Right, it comes down to a lot of times a discussion of budget.
Mhm.
So, and in this market, it's significant in the sense that there are a lot of owner operators that own cameras, and if they have a preference like Airy, they have the flexibility to price it to make the job work, and then they get to have that choice. I'm a renter, so I often I'm beholden to the budget question, and I'll shoot with anything. I like all of them. I mean, it depends on the usability too. It's like whether you're running around all day on Capitol Hill versus sitting on a dolly,
Right.
Yeah.
or how many it's like, or I got to be in a car, or I got to, whatever it is. And I really love the idea that you can just tailor the gear to the task. And there's way more choices than there used to be. And that's exciting. And even if you stay within a family of cameras, you can still do that. I mean, I would say it's interesting. Airy is the one. I mean, the Mini is their small camera, but it's not that portable in the sense of even Red now has a little Komodo that competes with all these little guys. So they're all kind of doing it, and they all work. They all work in unison. So I'm looking at a big picture thing of the project and what serves it best.
I think though, what's interesting about the way you approach things, Jim, is that you have a kit and you have your EVFs and you have some of your rigging parts and you have some of your other things that you bring to every job that is part of what you do, so that you make each camera your own and it is set up in a way that allows you to be flexible within a certain standard.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing is that, like, with all of these, especially the smaller cameras, you have to know how to rig them. You have to know what you're trying to do at the time that you're shooting with it. And what you have really systematized is how to,
get the most out of the
different cameras. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you look for some little foundation points within your camera system. Like for me, I use the same viewfinder for every camera except Airy, which is a gradical. So whatever camera I'm looking at the same viewfinder. And to me, that helps me interpret what all the cameras are doing, or my hand grips are the same. They all work on every camera. So there's certain little things that I don't care what the box is from a operating, I'll make it usable. And then the other nuances and things are something to consider too, probably after the budget, unless they say we don't care.
But
or it's politics, right? Some people go, we hear Airy is the most cinematic camera. I go, awesome.
Right.
Here's the quote.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Here's the rental for it.
No, but it's an important thing you brought up, Jim, with regard to, you the first thing you do is throw a gradical on it. I would say to somebody looking for an entry-level camera, while the price of an FS7 or a C300 is within reach compared to some of the higher, ridiculously expensive cameras, you do have to think about the viewfinder that comes with it. To me, was not really suited for professional work. I've been doing what I do for decades, and I put that FS7 viewfinder, and I'm like, are you kidding me? So I had to go out and buy a gradical, which was almost a third of the cost of the freaking camera with the, and so you get an expensive camera, at least your viewing system is going to be absolutely rock solid. You get an entry-level camera, you may have to still spend a little bit more. You're going to get a perfectly good sensor that'll give you really good images, but you may have to think about adding a little bit of money to really get it up to par.
Yeah, and oftentimes when you start with something small and you need it to do more, it ends up being cheaper to actually get rent a higher tier camera that actually has those capabilities built in.
Yeah.
Wonderful anecdote. Now, Arish, I think your first IMDb is Steadicam Op on Driving Miss Daisy.
I don't know if it's my first, but
it's definitely it's early. The thing that I loved about conversation we had, and this was a long time ago now, what was the first thing you ever bought?
First piece of gear I ever bought?
Yeah,
Tripod.
Tripod.
Yep. So cameras change, tripods don't, for the most part. So, there's a lot of things. And so I think the thing to take in consideration with all of this is that the camera is not the final point in the decision. It's somewhat along the way, and that there are other pieces that you need to consider before you get to that point. Money obviously being sort of question one within it. And then also, what do you need to do the job, and what do you need to actually make the job work? Can you make the day? Can you make your scripts on time? Can you deliver what you're trying to do in terms of setups throughout a day with the tools that you have? And those are the real questions that you have to ask whenever you try to put something together. And you're guiding, as a director of photography, you're often guiding your clients into what works best, and you can facilitate that conversation if you have an open line of communication. And I think it's important. But then at the end of the day, we all shoot with whatever they want, so we make it work.
Well, it's funny. It's about so we're at about 7:37. So I figured we'd maybe have to take a look at a few questions if you guys are up for that.
Please. Yep,
Okay,
absolutely.
so the first question is kind of one that that we get at the studio a lot, where Mason kids will come through, their film students are excited, they just graduated, and they're like, what kind of film camera should I buy now that I'm graduated? And my usual answer is, who are you shooting for? What kind of project? And do you need the flexibility? Do you need to find your clients first before isn't renting the best thing to start out doing before you go out and buy some kind of rig that you are locked into?
Yeah,
Rental guy.
I will say that for me, I won't buy anything unless I'm renting it 4 times a month. If I'm on a production that requires me, or I'm getting a certain type of job that requires me with a particular camera, a certain piece of gear, I won't consider investing in it until I have a regular, consistent request for it going into that, and that's my rule.
I think having an inexpensive camera that you can experiment with, go out and shoot. Let's just say an A7, make mistakes, experiment, just shoot a lot. That's great. But don't force your camera onto the production.
Right.
Listen to the producer, what their needs are, what the production needs are. If your camera is right for the job, then fantastic. But there are rental houses around that can help you. Like Peter and I just talked about, my first piece of gear I bought was a tripod, because every time I rented a tripod, they all work differently. My operating was all over the place, and I really hated that. I wanted to feel, have one thing consistent. It was like Jim's viewfinder.
Yeah.
I wanted my operating to be smooth and move when I wanted it to move and stop when I wanted to stop. So that tripod was so important to me. I think going to lenses next might be a good step. EF lenses you can use on many, if not all of these cameras.
All of them, yeah.
Cameras, difficult to pinpoint the camera that's going to work on all your productions. In fact, impossible. But having an inexpensive camera that you can afford, that you can go out and shoot, whenever and wherever you want, I think is a good thing to do. But I wouldn't spend a lot of money on it, and I certainly wouldn't count on that camera, being the end all for whoever hires you. It's just there's just too many choices out there, too many requirements. That you need to fit into a production that has already begun, or there's all kinds of reasons why your camera is not going to work for everything.
Right.
I think if you're a company, like a little production company, and you're managing your workflow from all the way through post, a lot of people do that, then you can sort of
That's
make
different.
the case
Yeah.
to get a camera that you're taking it to the end, so you're making the decision, and as long as they get a good product, they don't care.
Yeah, it's less of a conversation at that point. Whereas if you're looking to get hired as a director of photography or a camera operator or whatever it happens to be, it's a different conversation for sure.
Yeah, we've offered the Alexa sometimes when clients are using a dramatically less expensive, less sophisticated camera. And it's very funny when they're like, well, we haven't heard of that. We'll get back to you about that. And they've got to do a bunch of research to see if it'll cut with their $1,000 Panasonic camera or whatever, But it's kind of funny. A lot of times, you don't get to dictate the camera. if it's a project that's already shot in other cities and places, you're going to have to conform to whatever they've already selected.
Well, that makes complete sense. And actually, let's see. Lindsay, do you have some more questions that are burning from
Sure.
online?
Sure. One of the early questions from Dave was, is 4K the standard for a while? And when will we be seeing more 6K, 8K taking over?
Resolution.
Yeah.
That's part of the equation, isn't it?
You know, there is an interesting variable about resolution now that is relevant, because a lot of things I do are being shot for lots of different platforms, from TV broadcasts down to phones and Instagram. I mean, they're shooting something for lots of different uses, and that also means lots of different aspect ratios and a higher resolution camera. You know, if you're shooting a vertical 9:16 for Facebook, you know, you don't want to crop the sensor down to fit that. You'd rather have probably like an 8K sensor that you can start that vertical aspect ratio nice and big, and then everything else gets smaller, but in a bigger sensor. So like a red Monstro or something might be good for that multi-platform stuff, as opposed to something with a smaller sensor that you're going to have to cut into something really small.
Right.
So multi-platform use is very important these days for all the networks. You know, they're all putting stuff up on TikTok, and
Red Bull
all that
Media
stuff.
House has a whole
all these different
thing in
squares and
shapes
rectangles
sizes and everything
So,
else. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the Red to keep in mind is that it does capture 8K. There are cameras that exist that capture 8K. The Red ecosystem is designed around a pixel size in the sensor, and then capturing as much information as possible, but then delivering in something smaller. Because what you do then is you're shrinking down the photo sites, you're shrinking down the noise, you're reducing a lot of the things that are sort of inherent in capturing a digital sensor that is just part of the way electrical things move through other things. So I think that that's part of it. There's been a lot of study about the eye and the human eye. Max resolution for the human eye is around 5K. So, you know, the whole conversation about whether or not how close you're sitting to your television, if it's 1080 versus 4K versus whatever. And, you know, I think, you know, Japanese television has broadcast in 8K or something like that at some point. I don't know. I mean, you have to realize that this camera, the Alexa, has been shooting in 2K for 11 years, and it owned the market for basically 10 of them. It still does. I mean, it's still out and working, shooting commercials, doing all sorts of stuff. It's only in these small things where you've got Netflix or Amazon literally buying, just give me the footage, give me the content that they have to create a specific standard for it.
they're future-proof.
They're future-proofing it for sure. And so there are a lot of things to consider, but most of them don't focus around resolution. I think HDR is much more of a revolution in terms of imaging and image playback and capture than resolution. And that's always been the case. There's monitors that were 720p back in 2003, which were, this Panasonic monitor was just the best damn monitor you could get. You can't kill it with a tank. And it just looked great, but it wasn't even true HD. It was the only, you know, there's all these other monitors that didn't look as good, didn't give you as much color, much information in terms of like, what's the exposure on something or what's the color grade. And it's got nothing to do with resolution. So, I mean, I don't know.
The little DVX cameras started shooting at 24 and they became all the rage.
And that's 480p.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it was 720 for a number of years.
Yeah, the Panasonic VariCam was only 720p.
Yeah. I shot a lot of stuff with that camera.
That camera owned the world.
Yeah.
For a while.
So who knows if there's a ceiling? I don't know. I mean, right? I mean, it's also a marketing thing, right?
Yeah.
8K resolution will make people buy more TVs or something, right?
I think I'm definitely the youngest here, and so I've been doing this for 22 years now, and there's always something new. There's always something different, and you can drive yourself absolutely crazy with trying to stay up on all the technology or get the latest, greatest, whatever it is. Most of it is absolutely, it's all marketing. So people want to sell more TV.
Tripod.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Exactly.
you can hang yourself early on in this life trying to get the latest and greatest of everything all the
Sure.
time.
And you know, resolution is great for digital push-ins,
Sure.
digital, you know, changing angles. But we did have one very notable documentary that came in, and the director was fixated on shooting in 8K because it was the best, maybe. Now, this was for an interview that's not framed much different from I am. So if you had an 8K frame punch in, you're about, oh, I don't know, you're punched in a lot. So I don't think we're going to be seeing his eyeball in the interview, but
Well, so that's what stresses me out about that is that ability to reframe in post that happens when you start shooting high is terrifying, because what looks sharp to the regular raster of seeing the whole thing, when you punch in, your lenses better be real sharp or better be like there's a limit to that, and you have to be on the ball, which is why like we all use EVFs. Like I want to get the biggest, most clear, like largest image of whatever it is I'm looking at. And if I can magnify, I will, because you never know what's going to get reframed. And
You don't want somebody else making those aesthetic decisions for you
Right.
further downstream. The guy,
But they will.
one of the engineers from Aerie said, when I brought up that whole, well, people like to punch in, he's like, do you want people reframing your work? And the reality of life is it happens, once it's out of our hands. But
and let's send a big shout out to all our focus pullers out there, all the great
Yes.
ACs that keep us sharp. Lindsay, do you have another question?
Sure. Paris asked, looking to invest in a cinema camera, but also truly need the functionality of the power zoom for capturing events like this. What would you all suggest? Most cinema cameras, of course, don't offer power zoom and adapters. Does the Canon C series have the power zoom? It's been a daily dilemma for years.
It does. It
Yeah.
does. I can actually hit that one real quick.
Sure.
The C series has my favorite lens in the universe, the 17-120. And if you can imagine a re-engineered version of the good old fashioned 2/3 inch chip camera with the classic rocker zoom on it. Well, that's what that is, only for, I believe it's Super 35.
Yeah.
But I need it because I fly it on a jib. And it's the only thing that really has the true variables electronic controlled zoom. So Sony has a 17-110 zoom. That's sort of their Sony brand lens. It doesn't really have a good variable start out.
It's a kit lens, whereas the 17-120 uses a servo hand grip, very much like the old ENG stuff. And I'm just going to show something real quick. So this is that sensor chart again. If you look down at the little teeny pink one in the middle, oops, sorry, touched my iPad screen. That's that's the standard broadcast 2/3 inch chip sensor. So we're talking about covering an image circle that is really tiny, whereas you try to cover the image circle of a full frame or Super 35 camera, which is much bigger. The lens itself has to have characteristics in it physically. You cannot get around physics when you're talking about light. This is a full frame, well-corrected, good zoom right here. How much is this thing? $56,000? $42,000. It's not, this is what you need in order to do that for certain things. So there are ways to adapt ENG lenses. There's a B4 adapter for PL that exists in the world, which you got that, and you got some of the other older ENG lenses that cover the 2/3 inch chip that are still being made and are still wonderful glass. You can get a lot done. So we used to get like the 24-290, the big hammer, like it's a 14-pound lens and it requires its own zip code basically to move it around. And then we are able to grab FS7s and get this little B4 adapter made by I think Able Cinetech is teamed with them. There's a couple out there now. And then you get the broadcast lenses that have the little 2-time extender on it. And you've now got, a windowed, really nice Super 16 image going through the equivalent of like a 600 millimeter lens, and the lens is only this big. So, I mean, in terms of that, there are ways to do it. Are they inexpensive? Are they easy? Well, no. I mean, it's like to get into that world requires a little bit of correction. It's certainly you're able to do it, and having something that can scale back and forth within cinema, within talking head sort of interviews, which is really like there's so much of what we do is just humans with skin with photons falling on them. That's what we do for a living. So, I mean, it's.
In the price range, I don't know what price range the questioner is asking. Both Sony and Canon make, I say affordable, but they make servo zooms that are in the $5,000-$6,000 range. It sounds like a lot, but it's not 40,000, right?
Right.
So there, I think, but the compromise is to make them small. There's a focal length limit and then a f-stop limit.
Mhm.
So you get portability and affordability, but then you have compromises there. So there are affordable. Sony has their 2, and Canon has their 18 to 80 and their 7200. So you can do it for less money, but compromises.
Yeah. There's no one camera to rule them all.
They even make a little, Crazil even makes a little servo you can stick on a non-servo lens. It's like a little attachment. They've tapped screws in these things, and you can make these into that too. But if you want to pay $1,000 to be able to zoom electronically instead of using
and any of these large cine zooms, cine lenses can get a small Hedane motor, which Eric can hook you up with, and a zoom control.
Most of them are geared, adapted. You can, they've got gears, focus, zoom, and iris. So you just get an external motor and a controller, and then you power it, and some rods to rock the motor into it, and you can turn virtually any of these lenses into power zoom. But it does take a little fiddling.
It takes fiddling. It takes rigging. It takes prep. You can't just be like, hand me all this stuff and like run to the job and put it together. Like you have to plug
especially
it in.
if you want to be handheld as opposed to from a tripod. That's all that just adds the fiddle factor a lot.
Definitely. So the recommendation is probably to go down to your favorite camera shop and have the guys there show you what's going on before diving.
Yeah. And there might be some broadcast lenses that are out there that can be adapted. I mean, I think that's always a possibility. And the cost of those lenses is certainly lower. You're not going to get 4K full raster stuff out of it, but it's going to be usable. I mean, that's always the sliding scale for a lot of these things is what's usable, what's ideal, and they sometimes meet and a lot of times they don't. So you have to find ways to make all of that work to the best of your ability and how you understand camera systems and lenses and all this other junk that you have to kind of consider.
Absolutely. Lindsay, would you like to give us the next one?
Sure. So this Tara asks, can you just provide an idea overview, just general ballpark of what rental rates are?
That sounds like an Irish question.
For cameras, let me see the A7. I think we've got an A7 for around $125. And then it goes up, through the different strata. At the high end, I think what we have in our inventory is up to like 1,750. Yes, 1,750. So, and everything in between. But most of the cameras fall in the $300 to $600. I mean, you get very, very high quality, very capable cameras in that range.
And that's Red, Sony, and Canon.
Yeah,
at that point,
anything except for the Airy kind of falls out of that. But even the older Airy, the Amira is really just around the top end of that range I just gave you. 750, you can get an Amira. So you can get an awful lot of power. $300, $400, $500.
Yeah.
Well, and that's an interesting thing is that, you've got the Mini right here and everybody loves the Mini. Well, the Mini is like $1,300 a day or something like that. And the Amira is $750. And it's like, well, what are you shooting? Are you shooting a bunch of like different like things with gimbals and you're going on a crane, or you're doing whatever it happens to be, and you're doing a lot of high frame rate, or you're doing a bunch of interviews, you're shooting just 23.9.8 and you have audio going into the camera? Well, the Amira is the much better choice for 1,000 reasons, and it's cheaper. But people say, well, it has to be the Mini. Well, why? It's the same sensor. It's just designed to do different things. So, that's just something to think about within all these pieces, is that the cameras and the specs, and I didn't want to get into specs specifically because they're all a little different. And even within the lines, they're all a little different, and there are little gotchas and gimmies and limitations that happen within all of this stuff. But in terms of choosing that, there's a sliding scale. And oftentimes it's like, talking to producers is like, look, just tell me the budget. Don't make me guess what the number is. Tell me what I've got to work with, and I can usually give you a better option than what if you just said, well, tell me what you would shoot with imaginary. It's like, well, that's no one can afford
More
that.
work.
Yeah. So that's a whole other thing. But yeah, the good thing about renting is a variety of things. I met Arish in 2004 when the HVX 200 just came out. And I'd been in DC for about 3 weeks, and my rental house in Boston was obviously not close to me. And he had one of the first HVX 200s, which shot on P2 cards. So it was the first digital capture, digital card system that was in a sort of a lower tier for a lot of this stuff. And I just happened to catch him and email him or call him. And he happened to be there on a Saturday. And so we just spent the day, like I brought my laptop, we just got the card reader, and we just like started messing with it all. And we've had a relationship ever since. Which has been a few minutes. And you get information back and forth across all of this stuff. Rely on your rental houses, make friends with your techs, respect what they can do, have conversations. Just try to hang out. It's just like a groupie. When I raced bikes, I hung out at the bike shop. When I do camera stuff, I was always here. Well, not here. We were in Arlington for a little while. You were in Arlington, not me. Well, we both were in Arlington, actually. Now we've both moved to Fairfax. But it's a thing that you need to always consider within all of this, is that no one camera, no one lens, no one tool is the best thing for the job. And so you need to always work on, and especially with departments, as you're a director of photography and doing all these things, that you're relying on your team. And the rental house is a major part of your team. There's something to always consider, that when you're putting these things together, you're able to look at all of the people that can support you and help them help you. And it's something it's just relationships across the board.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really great advice. If you're really interested in becoming a fantastic director of photography in your time, and you're coming up trying to be a storyteller and a filmmaker, try to get a job helping a director of photography that really knows what they're doing. Get a front row seat to production, and yes, with the rental techs, I think everything Peter is giving you is just pure gold advice. Lindsay, are we at our pumpkin time frame here?
We are at 8 o'clock on the dot.
Okay, well, in that case,
Do we explode if we go past 8 o'clock?
no, we sure don't.
Okay.
Don't. Do we want to take another question, or people?
We're fine. We have snacks. We're good.
Shall we take another question, Lindsay? Are we good?
Sure. All
Okay.
right. So here's one from Daniela. Why buy a red DSMC2 over a Komodo, considering how much less expensive the Komodo is? Does the DSMC2 have a big leg up in some way?
It does in a variety of ways. They're very different cameras. The DSMC2 system is a variety of bodies. It's the Dragon X, which is the original Epic Dragon sensor, which is a 6K sensor, which is what I shoot with. The Gemini, which is a more Alexa-like sensor in the sense it shoots 5K, but it was actually designed for use on the space station, I think, or something like that. But it has an absurd ISO range and a dual ISO, which is the only red that allows that. Then you've got the Helium, which is a Super 35 8K sensor, and then the Monstro, which is the full frame 8K sensor. So the photosites are all a little different across all of these. The color science is roughly the same, but they all capture, they have different personalities within that. The Komodo's got sort of more like the Helium and the Gemini, probably closer to the Gemini in terms of like visual look. It does have, after my conversations with Red, thanks to working with Shane part-time, Shane Hurlbutt, ASC, they're a sponsor for his company. The Komodo has some stuff in it that's rather interesting in the way that they handle the codec and their processing, but it's a tiny box. So the Red cameras in and of themselves have more flexibility in the DSMC2 line in the sense that you have a greater range of codecs, you've got a greater throughput because you're going to red mags, which the data rate is much higher on those. So you can do 8K 2:1 RAW, which is a very, very low compression plus ProRes on the same card. Whereas the Komodo is CFast Express cards. There is a limit to those. They are consumer brand cards. So, I mean, there are pieces and parts to it. Also, you get the Komodo and it needs more and more stuff. You know, you can't just, most of the Reds anyways, you can't just like buy the body and turn it on. That's just one of the frustrations with it. It's like, what's the camera cost? And the camera says it's like, the body's 14,000. Well, I bought a camera and it was 35 by the time I built it out and made it like where I want it to be. So there's always that sort of expansion with it. The DSMC2 line is a little long in the tooth right now. I would say that it just depends on what you're working with. If you're starting out and you want a camera that you have a lot of flexibility with, you're going to have to do 2 system audio with it. You're going to have to record externally. You're going to have some limitations. But in terms of color fidelity, flexibility, in terms of the raw codec, where it is in terms of technology, it's kind of a little bit ahead in some of the ways that it's designed and set up. Didn't hear that from me, but there's some interesting things going on with it that are really interesting. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the Komodo is a better camera. It's a different camera for different uses in the sense that it's a great thing. I want to buy one for gimbal use because I'm always taking the Red on and off the gimbal and going to handheld and studio and sometimes on a teleprompter and then off a dolly and then onto the gimbal and whatever. And it'll be great to have another body, but I also need to stop buying things. So, you know, you can't just own stuff for the sake of owning it to make your life easier to a limit. I think owning your EVFs and your hand grips and that sort of thing, well, it makes your life a little bit easier overall.
That goes into the conversation about owning things for ease and convenience and also skill building, right?
Sure.
I mean, some things, you know, like Arish was saying, buying a small camera to practice and shoot and experiment, certain skill sets you can't get if you don't have the stuff around all the time, or in some cases you can't rent, like, you know, specialized gear like gimbals and steady cams and all these things that you can't really rent them and you can't really get good at them unless you kind of have them around all the time, which gives you a good reason to accumulate that stuff, which doesn't always give you the return on investment that a camera would.
Potentially.
So potentially,
Yeah,
It's a different kind
but
of
it's a
return.
different
Yeah.
thing. And then, but the shelf life can last you longer than a camera that I think at one point you said these things peak at about 22 months and then the new version comes out
Yeah.
and everybody wants a new version and you've got this old box. So there's an argument to acquiring non-camera things to your kit and experimenting with the cameras. You know,
Really good argument. And yeah, Arish, my first purchase was a tripod too. I mean, it was a Cartoni Delta. I still use it. It's still my favorite. And it was just kind of one of those things you buy for life, or you plan to anyway.
That's great.
And the other thing is lights. I mean, of course, we have a lot of LEDs, but I have lights that I bought in 1995 that are on our shelf right now. And,
Yeah.
you know, they, if you know how to use them, they look great.
There's no Bluetooth upgrade for the C stand or the baby stand or the flag. There's nothing. It's 100-year-old technology. There's nothing that's going to come out that's going to make it out of date in some way.
I mean, the DSMC cameras though are one of the better cases for being able to upgrade.
Yes.
Rather than a Sony, what you can't grow a Canon or a Sony. The advantage of them being all inclusive with the features also means that when the
Once
new
it's
one
done,
comes out,
done.
it's done. Whereas the Red, right? I think the brain can be upgraded.
Yeah.
Everything can be upgraded
Yeah.
to a certain point, which is a good long-term.
Yeah, I've
longer-term
upgraded
investment.
mine to the DSMT MC2 standard body. It was originally a Scarlett W that became a Dragon X,
Yeah.
which gave me all of the unlimited frame rates and processing that is in the Helium and the Monstro and the Gemini. It gave me a broader color space to work in IPP2. If I want to go to the Gemini, it's $4,900 to go, but it's just, again, I'm kind of happy with the Dragon and it's working right now. And my clients are really happy with what comes out of the camera. So I don't feel the need to change. If I suddenly start rolling in money somehow, I don't know what that feels like. Then I might just randomly grab other cameras or upgrade it for some reason. But I think that there are ways. Each of the systems have pluses and minuses, and that's the reality of it. Is it a disposable box, or is it something that you can maybe grow or have a path? I've invested in this. I might get a little bit money off the next one in the Red system, which is nice versus like you can buy used REs, even minis for $13,000. Maybe it's 30, I guess, really. It's not the mini, but like a full Alexa Studio SXTs or whatever are $7,000, like certified pre-owned on the RE website. So it's the value of all these things diminish the second. It's like buying a new car. You're going to lose 20% as soon as you drive the damn thing. So.
Well, Lindsay, you want to give us another question?
Sure. We had two people ask, where do you see Blackmagic cameras fitting into this conversation?
I knew that we were going to ask this question.
I had a feeling that was going to come up.
Yeah. I haven't used them a lot. I've shot with the Ursa Mini, and I thought it was actually a pretty good camera. Overall, it provides a lot of good stuff. There's a lot of great technologies in it. Certainly the price point is wonderful. For a straight up pick up and go EN or documentary style camera, you could do a lot worse than the Ursa Mini in a lot of ways. The problem with buying stuff is that if you own something and no one wants to rent it from you, then it's going to sit on the shelf. If you're only doing your work and you're only doing like your 48-hour film festival or your own productions that you're writing and directing and producing or whatever it happens to be, that's
what you want.
You get what you want, right? And so you get whatever Blackmagic camera or whatever. The problem is that for people who live here in this market, like all of us, is you get a call and it's like, hey, we're shooting this series. We shoot it on the FX9 with this lens, and can we hire you for 2 days? And you go, yes. And then you go do your job. And then you go and say, like, PBS Finding Your Roots was always a C300 Mark II. RBG was always a C300 Mark II. So it made sense for me eventually to just go, I'm just going to buy a C300 Mark II. Because if I'm renting it 4 or 5 times a month. I might as well, just have the camera. So I just pull it out of the bag and go. And so there's reasons for all these things. And so, like, for me, I have choices within this. Jim has choices within this. Arash can pick anything. He has all of this shit to play with.
And nobody's asking for Blackmagics.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I'm not saying that that's not absolute, but
Right.
I've never had anybody ask me to shoot with a Blackmagic.
Right.
They're great cameras. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, out in the real world where people are hiring cameramen for hire, it's rare.
Yep.
I would say maybe if you have some kind of thing that you make that's maybe you're doing it in your laptop and you have control over the whole workflow and you're not working for an external client, and you're making something that you know how to make, that could be a good fit. Because you're right. I don't hear Blackmagic as a request, and I don't see it on set very often. Occasionally I'll see a pocket 6K come out once in a while. But,
It's a great camera mount camera. I mean, it's like you can do like 4 or 5 of them in a car.
Mhm.
You know, interior
Lightweight.
stuff like the comedians in cars drinking coffee kind of style, or
Yeah.
whatever. Pick one of those versions.
Yeah, it's definitely a step up from GoPros.
Oh, for sure. And I would say that like if one of the interesting things, I forget which DP it was. I still listen to the Team Deacons podcast pretty regularly, although I've been falling off a little bit. And I was talking to somebody about film school. Oh, this might have actually been somebody I just recently interviewed for the Hurlbut blog. And they had gone to film school in Italy and for the director of photography track. And they just shot. They just shot and they would process and then they would watch it and they would all talk about it. That was it. And they would go back out and shoot. They would process. They would watch it all together and they would talk about it. And so you were literally shooting dailies over a period of time for 9 months with a bunch of other people, with professors and other things. And you're learning this stuff. You're seeing how things go together. You see what works because you're able to do these things. And so a black magic camera may end up being the right tool for you to get out and really experiment, because you have to be able to make a lot of mistakes. And we all make mistakes. We've all had mistakes. We're all lucky enough that we haven't made that one mistake where it's just like, you're done. And so I think that there is an opportunity for you to grow within the business or within the process, because it's ultimately, it is a business. If we were all had trust funds and could buy whatever we want and do that, we would. There are people out there that do that. But yeah, no, it's a thing that you have to really screw up a lot in order to get a mastery of
And
it.
it may be the perfect camera
Yeah.
for that.
For that.
To own that inexpensive camera that produces beautiful images that you can shoot, you know, whatever your friends'
Right.
things and make those mistakes. But don't buy that camera expecting
A return on investment.
the return on investment that you know the professional producers are going to be looking, you know, to hire you for that.
Exactly.
And if it is an entry-level camera, there are a lot of good used cameras out there as well.
Yep.
And that makes it even less of an anxiety jumping in.
Yeah, and there's some really wonderful used cameras out there. There's a C300 Mark I, which I used for 6 years, not that particular body, but like one like it for a very long time. And that camera ruled the world for a while. And it's
very cheap.
It's really cheap. And it's got great audio inputs. It's got time
Yeah.
code. It's got all these things. It's 1080, but boy, that image, like you could blow that sucker up and it looked just fine.
Yeah.
And I'd also add to that, there are certainly a lot of applications that right now are people that are zooming onto the internet. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about 1080 max. You know, a lot of people are going out 720. So
Yep.
you don't necessarily need 4K if your viewer is going to be watching their content on their phone on the toilet.
Right.
So
There are this kind of blew my mind, is that a lot of switching systems and a lot of broadcast stuff is still what would be called 1.5G. And 1.5G is an SDI spec. It's these cables that come off here. It's a little copper wire that comes out of the camera, which means that it would only support 1080i. Now, we live in a digital world now, so you try to put 1080i on a laptop or on a computer and put it on YouTube, and it just looks like boiled ass. It's just not your friend. So you're eventually like, well, then let's recording in 720p, because that's what the system will support, because you need that progressive thing. And so again, there are 1,000 instances where you're going to get into where going down in resolution might actually be helpful for the application that you might need.
okay, well, guys, it's 8:15, and I think on that note, and by the way, I didn't properly introduce America's Erich Roland. He of course owns DC Camera. I don't have a proper description for his credentials. Go to IMDb and drink it in. But on that note, I'd like to thank Peter Nicoll, Jim Ball, Erich Roland, and Dennis Bonney for the precious gift of their time this evening. I also want to thank Mike Ivey, the president of the VPA, and the VPA Executive Board for their continued support of filmmakers and producers across the state. The VPA is very interested in helping every echelon of content creator to make their own lane by finding ways to fund their projects and create jobs in our industry. When our industry is working, a lot of businesses and communities get to work from it. So stay tuned for similar VPA programs, many of which, get ready, will be in person, coming as soon as possible.
Hey now.
Anyway, so that should be fun. Now that we're getting vaccinated, we may
We're all
even have
vaxxed. Yeah.
max. Yep, exactly. And a lot of people in the industry are now, but it'll possibly some will be mask optional. We're trying to lead our way out of the pandemic as fast as we let our way into it. But my name's Lars, and I hope to get to see all of you on set sometime soon. Thank you and good night.
Thanks.
Thanks,
everybody.
Lars.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.